cabin door hung open in the February wind, frost gathering on the splintered frame where someone or something had clawed their way out. This is the story of how three sisters vanished into Appalachian folklore, taking the truth with them. Winter in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina didn't just arrive, it devoured. February 1873 brought the kind of cold that made timber crack like rifle shots, the kind that turned breath to ice before it left your lungs. In a narrow hollow 6 miles east of what would later become Boone, the Pritchard family cabin sat wedged between two ridges, smoke from its chimney the only sign of life for miles. Inside, 9 souls tried to survive the season. Outside, the pines groaned under snow so heavy their branches bent like old backs. The Pritchard triplets, Abigail, Bethany, and Clara, had been strange from birth. Everyone agreed on that much. Born on the same June night in 1852 during a thunderstorm so violent it split an oak down to its roots, they emerged into the world in perfect sequence, each exactly 7 minutes apart. The midwife, a Creek woman named Sarah Littlefoot, refused payment and left before dawn. She told the mother something in Cherokee that no one else understood, then walked 12 miles back to her settlement and never spoke of that night again. The girls grew identical in every measure. Same copper hair that caught lamplight like wire. Same gray eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. Same way of tilting their heads when listening, like birds hearing something in a frequency others couldn't detect. By age 7, they finished each other's sentences. By 12, they moved in perfect synchronization, one sister's hand reaching for a cup the exact moment another thought to drink. The valley folk whispered that they shared a single soul divided 3 ways, that you could tell one sister a secret and the other 2 would know it before sunset. Their father, Jeremiah Pritchard, worked timber and trap lines. Their mother, Margaret, kept the cabin and raised the younger children, twin boys named Thomas and James, age 9, and their baby sister, Ruth, barely 3. Jeremiah's brother, Nathaniel, lived with them too, helping with the heavier work, along with his wife, Constance. 9 people in a 2-room cabin through an Appalachian winter. The walls were thin enough to hear every breath, every whisper, everything left unsaid. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you're ready for a story that won't let you sleep tonight, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to be here for what comes next. The triplets turned 21 that previous June. Mountain custom said they should have married by then, started their own families, moved to their own plots of cleared land. But the sisters showed no interest in the young men who came calling. They showed no interest in anything beyond each other. They worked the cabin's small garden as one unit, mended clothes in perfect rhythm, and every night braided each other's hair in an elaborate pattern that took all 3 to complete. When one got sick, the others grew pale and feverish within hours. When one laughed, you'd hear it echo from 3 throats. Nathaniel's wife, Constance, kept a diary, one of the few written records that survived. In an entry dated January 15, 1873, she wrote, "The girls have been strange all winter, stranger than usual. They whisper to each other in the loft at night, and when I ask what they're saying, all 3 smile the same smile and tell me they're just talking to themselves. I suppose in a way, they are." The last supply run to the Valley settlement happened February 9th. Jeremiah and Nathaniel rode down on the 2 horses they owned, brought back flour, salt pork, lamp oil. The storekeeper, a man named Horace Webb, later testified that both brothers seemed nervous, kept looking back toward the ridge trail like they'd left something burning. When Horace asked if everything was well, Jeremiah said only, "Keep the girls in your prayers." Then they loaded the pack horse and rode back into the mountains. 3 faces in the lamplight, mouths moving in unison. That was February 9th. The cabin burned on February 20th. Between those 2 dates, something shifted in that hollow, something that turned blood relatives into kindling. The triplets never explained what happened during those 11 days of winter dark. They never had to explain. By the time anyone reached the cabin, words had become unnecessary. What the valley folk found in the ashes would make them question everything they thought they knew about the nature of evil and whether 3 people could truly share one murderous mind. But first, they had to survive the journey up the mountain, through snow that had started falling again, covering tracks that might have told them to turn back while they still could. The last person to see the family alive was a trapper named Silas Bone, and what he heard made him walk faster down the mountain instead of stopping to help. Understanding what happened requires knowing what the triplets were becoming in the weeks before the fire. Silas had been running his trap line along Panther Creek, checking for marten and fox, when he passed within 100 yards of the Pritchard cabin on February 18th, 2 days before everything ended. It was late afternoon, that gray hour when winter light drains from the hollows and shadows pool like spilled ink. He heard singing drifting down from the ridgeline. Not one voice, but 3, braided together in a harmony that made the hair on his neck stand up. The melody wasn't anything he recognized from church or the old ballads. It sounded older than that, wordless and circular, the kind of tune that seemed to loop back on itself endlessly. What made Silas keep walking wasn't the strangeness of the song. It was that when he looked up toward the cabin, he saw all 3 sisters standing motionless on the porch, facing outward into the trees, not moving, not swaying with the music, just standing there with their arms at their sides while that eerie harmony poured from their mouths in perfect unison. He watched for nearly a minute before one of them, he could never say which, turned her head in his direction without moving her body. The singing never stopped. Silas told the sheriff later, it was like watching puppets with the same string. The isolation of that hollow had always been a feature, not a flaw. Jeremiah Pritchard chose the location specifically because it sat beyond the reach of casual neighbors, where a man could work his land without interference. The nearest cabin was 3 miles south, occupied by a Cherokee family who kept to themselves. The settlement at the valley floor was a 2-hour ride on a good day, impossible in heavy snow. Privacy meant survival in those mountains, or at least that's what people told themselves. What it really meant was that no one heard screaming when it started. Constance's diary offers the clearest window into the cabin's final days. Her entry from February 16th reads, "The girls have stopped speaking to anyone but each other. Margaret asked Abigail to help with the baking this morning, and all 3 of them turned and stared at her until she apologized and left them alone. I don't know what they're apologizing for. J and N have been arguing in whispers. I think they're frightened, but neither will say why." The following day, February 17th. Ruth woke up crying last night, said the 3 ladies were standing over her bed watching her sleep. Margaret told her it was just a dream, but when I went to check on her, I saw muddy footprints on the loft ladder. 3 sets, same size leading up and then back down. It hasn't rained in 2 weeks. Where did the mud come from? Cold air, pine sap, something metallic underneath. The valley settlement operated on rhythms established over decades. Families checked on each other after major snowfalls, shared resources when game ran scarce, gathered for worship once a month in the schoolhouse that doubled as a church. But February 1873 brought a blizzard that sealed the mountain passes for nearly a week. No one traveled. No one visited. The Pritchard Hollow might as well have existed on a different continent. This is where we must pause and consider the uncomfortable question. How much of what happened could have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier? The signs were visible to anyone paying attention. The triplets' increasingly bizarre behavior, the tension building inside that cabin like pressure in a sealed kettle. Silas Bone heard the singing and walked away. Horace Webb noticed Jeremiah's fear and let him ride back into danger. The Cherokee family, 3 miles south later, admitted they'd heard strange sounds: laughter, breaking glass, shouting, drifting through the forest on February 19th, but assumed it was just a family quarrel and decided not to interfere. What would you have done? Would you have climbed that mountain to check on people who made your skin crawl? Or would you have told yourself it wasn't your business, that mountain families settled their own problems, that the cold and distance were excuse enough to stay away? The historical record suggests everyone chose safety over responsibility, and by the time someone finally made the climb, there was nothing left to save. Constance's final entry was dated February 19th, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic across the page. They've been in the loft all day. Won't come down for meals. Jay tried to go up there and check on them, but they threw something down at him. I think it was a piece of firewood. He came back down bleeding from the forehead. The twins are hiding under the bed. Ruth won't stop crying. Ann says we should leave tonight. Walk down to the settlement even in the snow, but Jay won't abandon his daughters. He keeps saying they'll snap out of it, that it's just winter fever making them strange. Margaret hasn't spoken in hours. She just sits by the fire rocking herself. I can hear them moving around up there, all 3 of them, their footsteps perfectly synchronized. Back and forth, like they're pacing in formation. God help us, I think. The entry ends mid-sentence. The diary was found later, water-damaged but readable, 20 feet from the cabin's ruins. What happened in the hours between that final entry and the first flames remains largely speculation. But the physical evidence, the testimony of survivors, and the confession that came much later allow us to piece together a timeline of horror that unfolded over approximately 8 hours, beginning sometime after sunset on February 19th and ending with the cabin ablaze just after dawn on the 20th. The triplets were done waiting, and when they finally descended from the loft that night, they brought something down with them that no one had seen before. A unity of purpose so complete it bordered on the supernatural. 3 minds thinking one terrible thought. 3 pairs of hands reaching for the tools that would end 5 lives and alter the course of an entire community's history. But first, there was the matter of the axe by the woodpile, and who picked it up when the screaming started. The axe handle was still warm when they found it in the snow, which meant someone had been gripping it for hours. This is where the story stops being about strange sisters and becomes about the machinery of murder. The fire started at approximately 6:15 a.m. on February 20th, 1873. A farmer named Dutch Keller saw the smoke column rising from the Pritchard Hollow while checking his livestock at first light. The smoke was black and thick, the kind that comes from burning more than just wood. He rode immediately to the settlement and raised the alarm. By 8 a.m., a group of 12 men had assembled with buckets and blankets, ready to fight the blaze. By the time they reached the cabin at 9:30, There was nothing left to fight. The structure had collapsed in on itself, roof timbers forming a charred skeleton against the white snow. The heat had been so intense, it melted the iron stove into a twisted mass and turned the window glass to liquid that ran down the remaining wall fragments like frozen tears. The men stood in a loose circle around the ruins, none of them speaking, all of them understanding that no one walks away from a fire that burns that hot. Then they found the bodies outside the cabin. Thomas and James Pritchard, the 9-year-old twins, lay face down in the snow 15 feet from what had been the front door. Both had made it outside. Both had been struck from behind with enough force to split their skulls. The wounds were identical, single blows to the back of the head, delivered with precision. The blood had frozen in dark halos around them, and their small fingers were still curled like they'd been reaching for something when they died. Sheriff William Cobb arrived an hour later with a deputy and the valley's only doctor, a man named Ephraim Cross. Dr. Cross examined the boys where they lay, then stood up slowly, his knees cracking in the cold. "These children didn't die in the fire," he said. "Someone killed them while they ran." 3 shadows moving as one in the dawn light. The search of the surrounding area took most of the day. The snow had started falling again, covering tracks, but the men worked outward in a spiral pattern from the ruins. They found Nathaniel Pritchard 70 yards into the tree line, propped against a pine trunk, as if he'd sat down to rest. His throat had been cut so deeply the wound gaped like a second mouth. The blood trail behind him suggested he'd crawled that distance after being attacked inside or near the cabin, trying to escape into the forest. He'd made it farther than his nephews, but not far enough. Constance was discovered near the creek, partially submerged in the shallow water, her gray dress spread around her like wings. She'd been stabbed multiple times. Dr. Cross counted 11 wounds in her back and sides. The knife work was frenzied but effective. She'd died quickly, probably before she reached the water. Someone had dragged her there afterward, though no one could explain why. Inside the collapsed cabin, once the timbers cooled enough to move them, they found 3 more bodies. Jeremiah Pritchard lay near what had been the hearth, his skull crushed by repeated blows. Margaret Pritchard was in the sleeping area, curled in a defensive position, arms over her head. She'd been beaten to death with something heavy. The stove poker was found nearby, bent and bloodied. Little Ruth, 3 years old, was underneath her mother, as if Margaret had tried to shield her at the end. The child's neck was broken. 8 members of the Pritchard household, 5 confirmed dead at the scene, 3 missing. Abigail, Bethany, and Clara were gone. The initial theory was that the triplets had died in the fire, that their bodies had been consumed by the intense heat or buried under debris yet to be uncovered. Sheriff Cobb ordered the men to sift through every inch of the ashes over the following 3 days. They found buttons, nails, fragments of pottery, melted coins. They found no human remains beyond the 5 already accounted for. No bones, no teeth. No trace of the 3 women who should have been the fire's primary victims if the massacre had been committed by an outside party. That's when the theory shifted. And when it shifted, the entire valley recoiled from what it implied. Dr. Cross performed examinations of all 5 bodies recovered from or near the cabin. His official report, filed with the county clerk on February 24th, noted several troubling consistencies. The head wounds on Jeremiah and the twins showed the same angle of attack, suggesting similar height and strength in the attacker. The The stab wounds on Constance demonstrated a right-handed blade user with enough force to penetrate winter clothing and break ribs. Most disturbing was his observation about the timing. Based on the state of rigor mortis and lividity, accounting for the extreme cold which would slow such processes, I estimate all 5 victims died within a 2-hour window, likely between midnight and 2 a.m. on February 20th. The fire was set several hours after the deaths occurred. Why wait? Why kill everyone in the dark hours before dawn, then remain in the cabin with the bodies for 4 or 5 hours before setting the blaze? The answer, when it came, was almost worse than the question. A young man named Peter Whitlock, who'd been courting one of the triplets the previous summer, he could never remember which one, rode up to the ruins on February 21st to pay his respects. He noticed something the others had missed in their horror and haste. On the wall of the root cellar, which had survived the fire by virtue of being dug into the hillside, someone had used charcoal to draw 3 figures holding hands. Beneath the drawing, in neat script that could have come from any schoolhouse primer, were the words, "We are finally free." The handwriting matched samples from all 3 sisters. Because of course it did. They'd always written the same way, formed their letters with identical loops and slants. 1 hand or 3. Did it matter anymore? Sheriff Cobb organized a manhunt that same afternoon. 30 men, some on horseback, most on foot, spreading out through the mountain hollows in every direction. They were looking for 3 young women in winter clothing, traveling together, probably frightened and confused. That's what Cobb told them. What he didn't say, what he barely let himself think, was that they might be hunting something that couldn't be divided, something that had murdered 5 family members with the cold efficiency of wolves culling the weak from a herd. The search continued for 11 days. They found nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of cloth, not a single witness who'd seen 3 red-haired women moving through the mountains. It was as if the triplets had dissolved into the February snow, becoming part of the landscape that raised them. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And in the weeks that followed, as winter grudgingly released its grip on the Blue Ridge, people began to hear things in the hollows after dark. Laughter, some said. 3 voices braided together, drifting through the trees like smoke. Always distant, always moving, always just beyond reach. The question wasn't whether the Pritchard triplets had killed their family. The evidence made that uncomfortably clear. The question was why, and whether they were finished. A blood-stained apron was found 2 weeks later in a barn 12 miles north, and all 3 sisters' names were embroidered on the pocket. This is where the law tried to make sense of something that defied every assumption about human nature. Sheriff William Cobb had served in that position for 8 years, dealing mostly with property disputes, drunk and disorderly conduct, and the occasional theft of livestock. He'd never investigated a murder. Now he had 5 on his hands, committed under circumstances that seemed to belong in Gothic fiction rather than the North Carolina mountains. He requested assistance from the state marshal's office in Raleigh, but the response came back that no one could be spared until spring made the roads passable. He was on his own. The apron discovery came from a farmer named Augustus Gill, who found it stuffed behind a feed barrel in his barn on March 6th. Gill's property sat at the northern edge of the county, along a ridgeline trail that eventually connected to Tennessee. The apron was cotton, once white, now stiff with dried blood. The embroidery along the pocket edge read AP, BP, CP in delicate cross-stitch. Abigail, Bethany, and Clara Pritchard. Margaret Pritchard had made matching aprons for her daughters the previous Christmas, each with their initials. This was one of them. Jill swore he'd checked that barn thoroughly the day after the fire, and the apron hadn't been there. Either he'd missed it, or someone had returned and hidden it later. The barn showed no signs of forced entry, but then again, mountain folk rarely locked their doors. The question of why someone fleeing a murder scene would carry a blood-soaked apron for 12 miles, then carefully hide it rather than burning it or burying it, troubled Cobb deeply. It suggested planning, deliberation, a mind working through problems step by step, or three minds working as one. The investigation expanded outward from that. Barn. Cobb interviewed everyone within a 20-mile radius, asking the same questions. Had they seen three young women traveling together? Had they noticed anything unusual on or after February 20th? Had they heard any strange sounds at night? The answers formed a pattern that was somehow worse than finding nothing at all. 7 different witnesses reported hearing laughter in the woods after dark during the last 2 weeks of February. A woman named Lucinda Hayes claimed she saw 3 figures standing at the edge of her property line at dusk on February 23rd, holding hands and swaying slightly before they turned and walked back into the trees. A traveling preacher named Reverend Solomon Mitchell said he passed 3 young women on a trail on February 27th who wouldn't make eye contact and who hummed the same tune in perfect harmony as they walked by him. He remembered thinking their synchronization was remarkable, like watching a choir that had practiced for years. When Cobb showed him a tintype photograph of the Pritchard triplets, taken at a county fair 2 summers prior, Mitchell went pale. "That's them," he whispered. "Lord have mercy, that's them." No witness could say where they were going or where they'd come from. Dr. Ephraim Cross, meanwhile, had been conducting his own investigation into the family's history. He interviewed the midwife who delivered the triplets, Sarah Littlefoot, now in her 70s, living on the Qualla Boundary Reservation. She initially refused to speak about that night, but Cross persisted, visiting 3 times before she finally relented. "I told the mother," Sarah said, speaking through an interpreter. "I told her what I saw when those babies came into the world. 3 bodies, but their cords were tangled together in a way I'd never seen. Braided, like someone had woven them on purpose. I tried to separate them, and all 3 babies started crying at the exact same moment, the exact same pitch. When I managed to cut through, each baby had the other 2's blood on them, mixed together. I told Margaret it was a sign. 3 made from 1, or 1 made from 3. I told her to watch them carefully, to teach them to be separate. She didn't listen. The cord tangling was medically possible, if rare. The rest, the synchronized crying, the blood mixing, could have been coincidence or the dramatization of memory over time. But Cross couldn't dismiss it entirely, not when everything else about the triplets defied normal explanation. He compiled a timeline of strange incidents from their childhood, gathering stories from valley residents who'd known the family. When the girls were 5, they fell through lake ice together. All 3 went under. All 3 surfaced in different locations at the exact same moment, gasping in unison. When they were 12, one sister broke her arm falling from a fence. The other 2 cried out in pain simultaneously and cradled their own right arms for weeks, even though the bones were unbroken. When they were 16, a boy named Lucas Trent tried to kiss Bethany behind the church. Abigail and Clara, standing 30 yards away in different directions, both screamed no at the exact instant his lips touched hers. The valley folk had called it witchcraft, and then they'd crossed themselves and whispered prayers and tried not to think about it too hard. Mountain communities learned to live with strangeness because exile meant death, and death was supposed to be the greater evil. Except now 5 people were dead, and the strangeness had teeth. Sheriff Cobb established a legal framework for prosecution, assuming the triplets were eventually found. The challenge was determining individual culpability. If 3 people shared a single consciousness, if the old stories about them were even partially true, then how did you assign guilt? Did all 3 hang for the crimes, or did you prosecute them as a single entity? The law had no precedent for this. Every murder case assumed individual agency, individual choice. What happened when the choices were collective? When 3 pairs of hands wielded the weapons, but perhaps answered to one will? The county prosecutor, a man named Terrence Walsh, argued that it didn't matter. "They're 3 separate bodies," he said. "3 separate souls in the eyes of God and the law. Each one is equally guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, if not murder itself. We hang all 3, or we hang none." But first they had to find them, and as March turned to April and the mountain laurel began to bloom, the sightings stopped. The laughter in the hollows went silent. It was as if the Pritchard triplets had heard Cobb's plans and decided to disappear more completely, to sink into the mountains so thoroughly that they became myth instead of fugitives. The investigation stalled. Cobb kept 2 deputies working the case full-time, following leads that went nowhere, interviewing witnesses whose stories changed with each telling. The state marshal's office sent an observer in late April who spent 3 days reviewing the evidence, then returned to Raleigh with a report that essentially said, "Without bodies or suspects in custody, there's nothing to prosecute. Maintain vigilance and report any developments. Maintain vigilance." As if you could keep watch over 10,000 acres of mountain wilderness, where 3 women who knew every ridge and hollow could hide indefinitely. The valley settlement tried to return to normal life. Families planted their spring crops. Children went back to playing in the woods without quite as much fear, though their mothers called them home earlier now, before the shadows grew long. The Pritchard property was left to rot, no one willing to claim it or work the land. The root cellar with its charcoal drawing stayed open to the elements, and people said that sometimes, on quiet nights, you could still see 3 figures standing on that ridge, holding hands and looking down at the valley like they were deciding whether to come back. Would you have stayed in that valley, knowing 3 killers might be watching from the tree line? Or would you have packed your family in a wagon and moved somewhere flat and open, where you could see threats coming from miles away? Most stayed. Because leaving meant admitting fear had won, and mountain people prided themselves on endurance. But endurance and ignorance are cousins, and the valley was about to learn that some threats don't announce themselves with smoke and screaming. Some threats wait in patience, moving slowly through the years, until everyone has almost forgotten to be afraid. Then they strike again. A child went missing in July of 1875, and the search party found her nightgown hanging from a tree branch with 3 long red hairs tangled in the fabric. This is where the legend began to separate from the facts, and where fear became its own kind of truth. Emma Dockery was 6 years old when she vanished from her family's cabin on the night of July 14, 1875, more than 2 years after the Pritchard massacre. The Dockery place sat 8 miles southwest of the burned cabin, far enough that most residents didn't draw an immediate connection. Emma's father, Gideon, had put her to bed at her usual time, around 8 p.m. When her mother went to check on her an hour later, the child was gone. The window stood open, its simple latch undone from the inside. The nightgown was found the next morning, draped carefully over a low-hanging branch a quarter-mile into the forest. The fabric was undamaged, not torn or dirtied. It had been removed and placed there deliberately, almost ceremoniously. Entangled in the collar seam were 3 strands of copper-red hair, each approximately 12 inches long. Sheriff Cobb had retired 6 months earlier, his health broken by the strain of the unsolved Pritchard case. The new sheriff, a younger man named Daniel Porter, organized a search with 40 volunteers. They combed the forest for 3 days, covering a 5-mile radius from the Dockery cabin. They found no body, no tracks, no further sign of Emma Dockery. She had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only that nightgown and those 3 red hairs that everyone in the valley recognized, but no one wanted to name. Dr. Cross examined the hairs under magnification and compared them to samples he'd kept from the Pritchard cabin, a hairbrush recovered from the ashes. The microscopic characteristics matched: same diameter, same pigmentation pattern, same slight wave at the root. "These came from one of the Pritchard girls," he told Sheriff Porter. "I'd stake my medical license on it." But which girl? And why take a child's nightgown and leave it as a marker? Was it a message? A taunt? Or something else entirely? Perhaps a sign that whatever had been human in the triplets had eroded further during their years in the wilderness? Emma Dockery was never found. The case remained open but inactive, joining the growing file of unexplained incidents that seemed to orbit the Pritchard sisters like planets around a dark star. Over the following decade, a pattern emerged, not frequent enough to cause panic, but consistent enough that people began to notice. Every 2 or 3 years, something would happen. A hen house would be raided, but instead of the chickens being eaten, they'd be arranged in a circle, all facing inward, their necks broken cleanly. A hunter would find his campsite rearranged while he slept. His supplies moved precisely 3 feet to the left, his rifle unloaded with the bullets lined up in a row on a flat rock. A woman traveling alone would report hearing footsteps behind her on a forest trail. Not 1 set, but 3 pairs moving in perfect synchronization, always staying just out of sight. And always, somewhere in the aftermath, people would find traces. 3 sets of identical footprints. 3 pieces of fabric torn from the same dress. 3 marks carved into tree bark, parallel and evenly spaced. The valley developed rituals around this haunting. Parents told their children never to go into the woods in groups of 3. Families hung bundles of mountain laurel over their doors. Someone had started a rumor that the triplets feared the plant because it had grown near their burned cabin. Young women avoided wearing their hair loose and long, afraid that resembling the sisters might draw their attention. The stories multiplied and mutated, each generation adding new details, until the historical Pritchard triplets became something else entirely. A cautionary tale, a boogeyman, an explanation for every unexplained loss and every strange sound in the mountain night. But underneath the folklore, the documentation continued. Dr. Cross, who lived until 1903, kept meticulous records of every reported incident that might connect to the sisters. His journal, donated to the County Historical Society after his death, contains 73 separate entries spanning 3 decades. He remained convinced until his final days that the triplets were alive, hiding somewhere in the vast Appalachian wilderness, living off the land and making occasional forays into settled areas for reasons he could never quite determine. "They're not ghosts," he wrote in an entry dated November 1881. "Ghosts don't leave footprints. Ghosts don't steal food from root cellars. Ghosts don't age. And I believe the Pritchard sisters are aging just like anyone else, growing older and wilder with each passing year, but still together, still moving as one, still thinking thoughts we can only guess at. 3 figures in the mist, never quite solid. The last confirmed sighting came in April of 1889, 17 years after the fire. A railroad surveyor named Charles Brennan was mapping potential routes through the mountains when he encountered 3 women sitting on a fallen log near a creek. He described them as middle-aged, he estimated late 30s, with long, gray-streaked red hair and identical features. They wore clothes that appeared handmade from animal skins and rough woven fabric, primitive but functional. They were braiding each other's hair in that intricate pattern, the one that required all 3 participants, their fingers moving in coordination that seemed almost mechanical. Brennan greeted them politely. They didn't respond, didn't acknowledge his presence. He asked if they needed assistance, if they were lost. Still nothing. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes, watching them work on each other's hair, before his unease grew so strong that he left, marking the location on his map and making a note to avoid that section of creek in future surveys. When he mentioned the encounter at a boarding house that evening, the proprietor went pale. "How far up Panther Creek?" she asked. When Brennan showed her the location on his map, she nodded slowly. "That's near the old Pritchard place. You met the sisters. You're lucky they were occupied." "Lucky? Why lucky?" "Because," she said, "the last few men who tried to talk to them ended up walking in circles in the woods for hours, confused and disoriented, unable to find their way back to the trail until morning. One of them said he kept hearing their laughter all around him, coming from every direction at once, like they were playing with him." Brennan left the area the next day and never returned to that section of the mountains. His report, filed with the railroad company, suggested an alternate route, citing difficult terrain and unpredictable local conditions. The railroad was built 20 miles south. As the 19th century drew to a close, sightings became less frequent. The last documented incident occurred in 1906, when a group of children playing near an abandoned mine shaft found 3 matching copper hairpins arranged in a triangle on a flat rock. The pins were old-fashioned, the style popular in the 1850s and 60s. No explanation for their appearance was ever determined. After that, silence. For decades, nothing. The valley grew and changed. The settlement became a town with a proper main street and a courthouse. The mountains were logged, roads were cut, electric lines were strung. The world modernized, and with it, the old stories began to fade into quaint history, the kind of thing elderly residents shared with curious visitors, but no one really believed anymore. The Pritchard triplets became a footnote, then a legend, then a half-remembered tale that people argued about the details of. Did they kill 5 people or 7? Was it a cabin fire or a barn? Were they identical or just sisters? The specifics blurred and softened with time's passage. But in the deep hollows where the roads still don't reach, where the forest grows thick enough to block the sun even at noon, there are places where people don't go. Hunters avoid certain ridges without quite knowing why. Hikers find themselves turning back from particular trails, sensing something wrong in the silence. And on very still nights, when the wind drops and the temperature falls, some claim you can still hear it. 3 voices braided together, laughing in the darkness, the sound moving through the trees like a current flowing downhill. The law never caught them. Time never claimed them. They simply disappeared into the landscape, becoming part of the mountain itself, waiting, perhaps, for someone to remember their names and call them back into the world. But remembering is dangerous when the thing you're remembering might still be listening. A letter arrived at the county clerk's office in 1923, postmarked from a sanitarium in Virginia, and it changed everything we thought we knew. This is where the story demands we question which version of evil is more terrifying, the monster or the human being. The letter came in a yellowed envelope, addressed simply to whoever keeps the records. Inside, 4 pages of shaking handwriting, some sentences trailing off mid-thought, others circling back on themselves like the writer kept losing the thread. At the bottom of the final page, a signature, Clara Pritchard. She was dying. Tuberculosis had hollowed her lungs over the course of 2 years, and the doctors at Highland Sanitarium gave her less than a month. She was 71 years old. She wanted, the letter said, to tell the truth before it died with her. Because, she wrote, lies are lighter than truth, and I've been carrying truth for 50 years until it's bent my spine and stolen my sleep. Let someone else carry it now. The county clerk, a man named Howard Finch who'd grown up on the old stories, contacted Sheriff Porter, now elderly himself, but still alive and sharp-minded. Together they traveled to Virginia, arriving at the sanitarium on a gray November morning when frost made patterns on the windows that looked almost like reaching hands. Clara Pritchard sat propped up in a metal frame bed in a long ward full of consumptives, each one separated by thin curtains that offered the illusion of privacy. She looked ancient, her red hair now completely white, her face carved deep with lines that mapped a lifetime lived outdoors. But her eyes were the same gray as the photograph from 50 years earlier. And when she spoke, her voice carried that peculiar cadence that old valley residents remembered, the rhythm of someone used to speaking in unison, who'd had to relearn how to make words alone. I need you to understand something before I start, she said, after Porter and Finch identified themselves. We weren't monsters from birth. We were just 3 girls who loved each other more than anything else in the world. And that love rotted into something poisonous because nobody taught us how to be separate. What Clara confessed over the course of 4 hours, broken by coughing, fits and long pauses for breath, dismantled the legend piece by piece and replaced it with something more terrible precisely because it was more ordinary. The triplets hadn't shared a supernatural connection. They'd shared a mother who was terrified of them, a father who saw them as curiosities rather than daughters, and a community that treated them like a spectacle. From earliest memory, people encouraged their synchronization, delighted in it, rewarded them for performing their strange unity. When they finished each other's sentences, adults clapped. When they moved in coordination, people called it marvelous. When they dressed alike and refused to be separated, everyone said how sweet it was that they were so close. We learned that we were most loved when we were most the same, Clara said. So we became more the same. We practiced. We studied each other until we could predict every gesture, every thought. It wasn't magic. It was work. And after years of work, it became prison. By their 20th year, the triplets had created between them a kind of collective identity that superseded their individual selves. They couldn't make decisions independently. They couldn't disagree without feeling physical distress. They'd trained themselves so thoroughly to function as one unit that genuine autonomy had become impossible. We'd built a cage out of each other, Clara said, and we didn't realize we were trapped until we tried to open the door. The winter of 1873 brought a crisis. A young man from a neighboring county had proposed marriage to Abigail. Actually proposed. with a ring his grandmother had worn. Abigail wanted to say yes. Bethany was terrified of being left behind. Clara, caught between them, felt herself being torn in half. For the first time in their lives, the triplets couldn't agree on something fundamental. "We fought," Clara said. "For weeks we fought. Not with words, because we'd almost forgotten how to speak to each other like separate people. We fought with silence and cold looks and little cruelties. The cabin was so small, and we couldn't escape each other. And our family just watched it happen, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, hoping we'd work it out ourselves. Three minds cracking under pressure they couldn't name. The breaking point came on February 19th. The details Clara provided matched the timeline Dr. Cross had constructed decades earlier. The triplets had been in the loft, arguing in whispers, when Abigail announced she was going to accept the proposal and leave. Bethany grabbed her arm. Clara grabbed the other. Abigail tried to pull away, and something in that physical struggle, the first time they'd ever fought bodily, triggered a cascade of panic and rage that had been building for months. "We came down from the loft together," Clara said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "And we were all so angry, so desperate to make the pain stop." Bethany grabbed the axe by the door. "I don't know which one of us decided first. I don't know if it was a decision at all, or just something that happened when we were all thinking the same dark thought at the same time." Their father tried to stop them. He was the first to die. Their mother tried to protect the children. She was the second. Nathaniel ran. They chased him into the trees. Constance tried to hide. They found her. The twins made it outside and the triplets followed. Little Ruth never had a chance. "5 people," Clara said, tears cutting tracks through the hollows of her face. "5 people we killed because we couldn't figure out how to be 3 people instead of 1. And when it was over, when we stood there in the snow covered in our family's blood, you know what we felt? Relief. Pure, terrible relief. Because the problem was solved. Abigail couldn't marry and leave us now. No one would ever try to separate us again." They stayed in the cabin until dawn, washing the blood off in the basin, changing into clean clothes, gathering supplies. They set the fire to destroy evidence, but also to destroy the place where they'd been made into something unnatural. Then they walked into the mountains and kept walking for 50 years. "We separated eventually," Clara said. "Took us 10 years in the wilderness, but we finally learned to be apart. Bethany died in 1904 from a fever. Abigail died in 1912 from a fall. I kept moving, kept hiding, because I was afraid if I stopped, someone would recognize me and I'd hang for what we did. But nobody ever recognized me. Nobody was looking for an old woman alone. They were looking for 3 young women together. The legend of the laughing triplets who roamed the mountains for decades? Mostly fiction," Clara said. "They stayed within a 20-mile radius of the burned cabin for only the first few years, stealing food and supplies when necessary, occasionally spotted, but never caught. The incident with Emma Dockery? Clara admitted to that. They'd taken the child's nightgown from a clothesline, intending to use the fabric, but got frightened and abandoned it. The girl had run away on her own, unrelated to them. Clara read about it in an old newspaper years later. The matching hairpins in the mine shaft? She'd left those herself in 1906, a deliberate false trail to keep people looking in the wrong places while she traveled east toward Virginia. Most of what people think they know about us is stories they told themselves, Clara said. We were just 3 damaged girls who killed our family and spent the rest of our lives trying to live with it. No magic, no shared soul. just trauma and codependency taken to the worst possible conclusion. Sheriff Porter asked the question that hung in the air. Why confess now? Clara smiled, and for a moment, you could see the ghost of the young woman in the old photograph. Because I'm the last one. Because the story dies with me if I don't tell it true. And because 50 years is long enough to carry this alone. Let everyone else know what we really were. Maybe it'll help someone recognize the signs before it's too late. She died 4 days later, December 3rd, 1923. The confession was filed with the county records, where it sat largely unread for decades. The newspapers printed brief notices. Last Pritchard Triplet confesses to 1873 murders. But the story had lost its sensational edge after half a century. People preferred the legend of the ghost sisters in the mountains to the reality of 3 traumatized women who destroyed their family because they couldn't imagine existing apart. Truth is often disappointing that way. It trades mystery for meaning, horror for sadness. But it doesn't make the deaths less real or the tragedy less profound. 5 people still died in that hollow. A family still burned. And 3 sisters still spent their entire lives trapped by something they'd built together and couldn't dismantle until time and distance and death did it for them. The question Clara's confession raises is one we're still asking today. When does closeness become pathology? When does love become control? At what point do we look at people who seem inseparable and recognize it not as connection, but as captivity? And what do we do when the captors and captives are the same people? When the prison is made of flesh and shared history and the inability to imagine any other way of being? Clara Pritchard never answered that. She just told her truth and let it fall where it may. Whether that truth redeems anything or explains anything or helps anything is not for her to decide anymore. It's for us to carry now, along with the weight of 5 bodies in the February snow and 3 women who became their own worst enemy because nobody taught them they were allowed to be 3. A hiking trail was closed last summer near Boone, and the Park Service won't say exactly why, only that historical disturbances make the area unsuitable for public access. This is where we must confront what remains when the story officially ends, but the questions refuse to die. The Pritchard Hollow sits on what is now protected forest land, part of the Pisgah National Forest System established in 1916. The burned cabin site was never rebuilt. For decades it was simply avoided, then gradually forgotten as roads shifted and old trails were abandoned. By the 1950s, most locals couldn't have pointed it out on a map. The forest reclaimed it, covering the ashes with decades of leaf litter and new growth, until nothing remained visible except a slight depression in the earth and the root cellar entrance, now collapsed and filled with debris. In 2008, a team of archaeologists from Appalachian State University received permission to excavate the site as part of a larger project documenting 19th century settlement patterns. What they found complicated Clara's confession in ways that continue to generate debate. The excavation uncovered the expected items: melted household goods, charred timbers, fragments of the iron stove. But they also found 3 objects that hadn't been mentioned in any historical record. Buried approximately 6 inches below the ash layer, deliberately placed in a triangular formation, were 3 identical knives. Hand-forged 6-inch blades, wooden handles carved with the same geometric pattern. The metal was analyzed and dated to the mid-1800s. The handles showed wear patterns consistent with decades of use. Dr. Patricia Moreno, who led the excavation, noted something peculiar about the placement. These weren't dropped or lost. They were arranged with care, point inward, forming a perfect equilateral triangle. And they were buried before the fire, based on the soil stratification. Someone made a deliberate decision to hide these weapons in a specific configuration, then burn the structure above them. The knives were never mentioned in Sheriff Cobb's evidence inventory. They weren't in Dr. Cross's reports. And Clara, in her deathbed confession, never spoke about burying anything before setting the fire. Either she forgot, or she chose not to remember, or there were details she took to her grave despite claiming to tell the whole truth. The university attempted to trace the knives' origin. The craftsmanship suggested they were made by the same blacksmith, custom orders rather than general goods. Records from the 1860s and 70s in that region were incomplete, but they did find one intriguing reference. A blacksmith named Samuel Goins, who worked in the Valley settlement, kept a ledger that survived in his family's papers. An entry from June 1872, 8 months before the murders, recorded 3 matched blades for J. Pritchard, specialty work, paid in full. Jeremiah Pritchard had ordered 3 identical knives. For what purpose? Why matching? And why did his daughters bury them in that specific pattern before destroying the evidence of their crime? The questions multiply rather than resolve. The archaeological team also documented something that couldn't be photographed or cataloged: a persistent sense of unease at the site. Multiple team members reported feeling watched, hearing movement in the surrounding trees that stopped whenever they turned to look, finding their equipment rearranged in the mornings despite the site being secured at night. Dr. Moreno, a scientist who emphasized empirical evidence over superstition, nevertheless included a note in her final report. Several team members requested reassignment to other dig sites. While I cannot validate their subjective experiences, the psychological impact on the crew was significant enough to affect productivity and morale. The excavation was completed, the findings were published in an academic journal, and the site was resealed and left unmarked. No memorial plaque was erected. The Forest Service decision was that commemorating a mass murder site might encourage dark tourism, and the area's remoteness made supervision difficult. But the hollow continues to draw attention, particularly online. True crime forums debate the case endlessly, dissecting Clara's confession for inconsistencies, arguing about whether the triplets really acted alone or whether someone else was involved. Reddit threads spiral into thousands of comments, each person offering theories about the buried knives, the synchronization, the decades spent hiding in the mountains. YouTube videos rack up millions of views, most of them recycling the same information, with increasingly dramatic narration and stock footage of misty forests. The legend persists in evolved form. Modern hikers report strange experiences on trails near the hollow, compasses spinning wildly, cell phones draining instantly, the sensation of being followed by multiple people who remain just out of sight. These accounts are almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated, the product of suggestion and the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Almost certainly. But in 2018, something happened that even skeptics couldn't easily dismiss. 3 women, sisters, though not triplets, went hiking in the area on an October afternoon and didn't return. Search and rescue deployed for 6 days, covering hundreds of acres. They found the women on the 7th day, sitting together under a pine tree 3 miles from where they'd entered the forest, holding hands and unresponsive. Medical evaluation showed no injuries, no signs of exposure or distress. But none of the 3 could remember anything about the previous week. Not where they'd been, not what they'd eaten. Nothing. Their families took them home. Within a month, all three sisters had moved back in together despite having established separate households years earlier. They stopped answering questions about the incident, and according to a nephew who spoke to a local reporter on condition of anonymity, they'd developed an unusual habit. They finished each other's sentences now, something they'd never done before. The Park Service closed that section of trail shortly afterward. Historical disturbances was the official reason. When pressed, a spokesperson would only say that the area presented unique challenges that made it unsuitable for recreational use. The trail remains closed, the signs stay posted, and people generally respect the boundary, though occasionally someone ignores it and comes back changed in small ways they can't quite articulate. What do we do with a story like this? How do we file it away in our understanding of the world? Clara's confession offered a rational explanation. Three codependent sisters who destroyed their family because they couldn't conceive of separation. But the buried knives suggest premeditation that Clara never admitted. The decades of sightings suggest the triplets maintained their bizarre unity far longer than Clara claimed. And the modern incidents, unverified, anecdotal, possibly meaningless, suggest that some places hold echoes of the trauma enacted upon them, regardless of whether we believe in such things. The Pritchard case remains officially closed. 5 murders, 3 perpetrators, all deceased. Justice was never served in any formal sense, though whether the sisters' 50 years of exile constituted punishment is a philosophical question without a satisfying answer. The historical record is complete enough to understand what happened, if not entirely why. The legend has been demystified, reduced to psychology and desperation rather than supernatural horror. And yet, 3 matching knives buried in a triangle. 3 sisters who found each other again after a century and a half. 3 voices in the darkness, always together, never quite silent. The math keeps coming back to 3, the number that defined the Pritchard triplets from birth to death and possibly beyond, if you believe in such things. Most people don't. Most people prefer rational explanations, psychological frameworks, the comfort of knowing that monsters are made, not born. But on very quiet nights, when the wind moves through the hollows in a particular way, some people swear they can still hear it. Laughter, braided together, drifting through the trees like smoke from a fire that burned 150 years ago, but somehow never quite went out. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.